Good morning, everybody. Welcome. Thanks for being here on time. We're keeping up the intensity of what we did yesterday for 5 hours. My name is Nick Gowing, founder and director of the Thinking the Unthinkable project, but my job is to make sure that we get going with the same spirit as yesterday. Today is a day which is combining building bridges and UNEP FI, and the first 50 minutes is going to be about accelerating systems change through finance, continuing the spirit of yesterday. We're going to be hearing from Patrick and Eric. We'll be hearing from Rémy Rioux, who's going to be joining us virtually from Paris. We're going to be hearing from the IFC, and then we're going to be reflecting on the rights, the human rights, which underpin so much of the judgment that we're making here, and we'll be hearing from two leading figures in that area as well before 10 to 10. So let me invite Eric and Patrick up onto the platform. They're going to talk to each other without me, which is a great relief probably. So Eric, I shall welcome, the head of UNEP FI, and also Patrick Odier, who many of you would have seen yesterday, who's chair of Building Bridges. Bonjour.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Nick, and a pleasure to be with you all this morning and to bring together the Building Bridges and the UNEP FI community. First time we've done this, and so far, so very good. I think we're going to start by trying to frame, and there were some very good discussions yesterday at Building Bridges, but we're going to start to frame the discussions for the next couple of days with a couple key points to try to position where are we at today. And I think, let me take the first one, maybe to state the obvious, climate action is falling short and the political headwinds are growing. But I think for you all in the room, generally acknowledge that the direction of travel is clear, both in terms of the science, including, for instance, the parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere, but in terms of the technological industrial revolutions that are getting underway. I think on the negative side, UNEP's emissions gap report has, puts it in stark relief. 2023 emissions grew 1.3% to 57 gigatons. We need to drive down emissions 7.5% per year between now and 2030 if we're going to hope to stick to a 1.5 trajectory. So we need to bring them down 42%. If policy commitments as stated today are fully carried out, then we are looking the potential to reduce emissions by 10% by 2030. That means roughly 2.6%. Of warming. So much more policy ambition is needed. On the positive side, there is green shoots. So there are some really significant positive developments. You can draw on many, I think. Global EV, new car vehicle registrations globally, 17% last year. In China, over 50%. Different sectors, different industries are turning over. No one can turn a blind eye to, the only constant today is change. A couple more statistics. Indonesia recently announced plans to retire all coal and to build 75 gigawatts of new renewables capacity in the next 15 years. India has delivered 80% of its 2030 land restoration target, restoring almost 19 million hectares. Now, I mentioned these three. They come from the Asia region. For many reasons, we know Asia is key to our future, and we are seeing some positive developments. What about the financial trends? If I can quote our good friend Christiana Figueres, where finance goes, so goes emissions. And I'm very pleased to report that since signing up to the Net Zero Banking Alliance in 2021, 80% of the world's largest banks have decreased their financing for fossil fuels, some by as much as 50%. And I say that quoting data from many of the big NGOs who are normally so critical on the banks. But if you read into the numbers, there are some positive signs. Signatories to the UN Principles for Responsible Banking have surpassed 50% of global banking assets, including now all the globally systemically important is the G-SIB banks from China, from whom we're really pleased to have a very strong delegation this week, as well as from many other parts of the world. We have a contingent of insurers as well, representing the principles for sustainable insurance. And these insurers, many of them are also part along with pension funds of the Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance. And they have published data earlier this year that show that they as a group, which represent 89 investors, $10 trillion US in assets, that they have been driving down their emissions roughly 6% per year over the last 5 years. So a little bit falling short of the 7.5, but still remarkable progress in showing that it is possible. And this year we have the very significant, the Building Bridges financial community, with who we're very pleased to have partnered for this joint convening and to build up the energy. These are all important pieces and constituencies in the climate action puzzle, but I think you all agree that the full picture will require the formal climate process to pick up the pace. And for that, let me hand it over to Patrick.
Thank you, Eric. As we hear you, I think we realize that many things are happening despite, of course, the negative mood that has been brought by all those turbulences of the 2024 year. And I think that if you look at, for instance, the recent COPs, whether in Baku or in Cali, actually, yes, we notice that the pace is probably not as fast as it should, but the scale at which now we're approaching the problems has improved in a significant way. The fact that the new financial goal for the developed countries to provide 300 billion to developing countries is frustrating. It can be understood, of course, because the figures that were put to the negotiation were much higher, but we just had completed the first commitment of the 100 billion 2 years ago, and I think to triple this initial commitment is already a sign that we want to, and the world is really moving in the right direction. I think we should recognize that. What is important, I think, is to make sure that we progress also in defining how this financing will be provided, and what will be the public and the private part of it. And I think, as we said yesterday, galvanizing the private sector is of the essence today. We know that we need private money and private capital, and I think in this respect, that's probably where the COP, the recent COP in Baku felt really short, in my view. More promising on the other side was, of course, the discussions on the carbon market and on the rules for governing country-to-country carbon trading under Article 6.2. And I think this is really interesting because this really will make the difference and help us progress towards pricing externalities I think, in a very determined way. These new rules will establish actually the first world Paris-aligned crediting standards, that is about 10 years after these standards were, the Paris Agreement was signed. And I think this will include environmental and human rights safeguards as well as additionality checks and things like this. And this is what the market is really waiting for. In terms of mitigation, what government did take forward was any progress was, of course, that there was no progress in operationalizing the transition away from fossil fuel. I personally did not understand why there was so much publicity made about it. I think we had last year at the very last minute a very, very forceful statement made at the COP, and it is a bit of a pity that this discussion turned out this way at the time where we all agreed to phase out fossil fuel. To put this back into the question was probably not that positive. At the Nature COP, well, we had a major breakthrough also by having over 100 countries, 119 countries submitting national biodiversity targets, and progress was made in many areas that touches on biodiversity, whether it's sustainable wildlife management, invading alien species, etc. And I think this has to be recognized also as a progress. So, of course, short of ambitions, but progressing nevertheless on the right track. Action on nature, as we heard also yesterday, is absolutely essential, not only for nature, but also for climate. Actually, one can ask whether it really will make sense in the future to continue to have two COPs, one on nature and one on climate. We should probably bring the two together as fast as we can. But we should now certainly move from how to what, and what should be the systemic transition needed to take place now in order to make sure that our global system, our global economic system aligns with the global biodiversity framework itself. So a sort of a view today that many things have been negatively put to us, but while at the same time things are progressing, we have now areas of focus where we can all concentrate on.
Great. So I think the reality today is for you all to learn to operate in a multipolar world and to read between the lines, to understand where the movements are happening. Central banks organized under the Network for Greening the Financial System, the NGFS, have released findings last month that show that climate change is becoming a first-order factor for economies. They specifically found that a lack of policy ambition increases costs of mitigation policies and further increases economic losses from the physical impacts of climate change. But even with the economics becoming increasingly clear, jurisdictions are developing regulatory approaches to sustainable finance at varying speeds. Europe has been at the forefront, while Asia Pacific and Latin America have seen quite noteworthy progress in recent years. Africa is still in the early stages, and North America, to be frank, is moving in some different directions. Operating in a multipolar world is challenging, and more interoperability is needed between approaches, for instance, between taxonomies and frameworks for transition finance. But we believe for the financial sector really to play its enabling role, really effectively, we need clear and actionable national transition plans from governments. We start to see this from some, but we need it from more. These plans should outline the decarbonization trajectory, the deployment of climate solutions, and the regulatory frameworks and incentives that will support their implementation. And of course, governments and MDBs and other development finance institutions need to scale up blended finance as a key tool for linking national decarbonization targets with sector-specific transitions by mobilizing capital for some of the high-impact projects that otherwise lack funding. Patrick, with all the conflicting signals, which way should financiers be focusing?
Well, I think, finance and business should really focus on navigating towards the future and not towards the latest election cycle, actually. While political fluctuation may temporarily, of course, slow down the overall efforts towards climate and sustainability action in some jurisdiction, wherever we think now, or it's in different jurisdictions, is a discussion to have. The overall trajectory, as we heard, is there. We know that we are in the midst of the transition. We heard it yesterday from Jan Rockström, for instance, and that was not a usual comment from him, and I think this is very good news. So what we know is that finance and business in general is now engaged, and that we have to look at reinvesting in the tooling of the economies for energy, for security, for growth, and for green jobs, and this is creating huge opportunities, and I think that's the good news about the situation. Financiers and corporates who only focus on the near term will, of course, exist and continue to exist, but I think what they risk here is major stranding of assets, and I think the risk will become very obvious to most of the financial circles and economic circles. There will be 5, 6 elections in every democracy between now and 2050, so we cannot afford as businesses to just react to those elections anymore. Some will help, some will hinder, some will be signals, some will be really obstacles, but the long term, as we heard, is becoming shorter, and we have to make sure that we use this opportunity now to really reinvest massively in the right directions for a more sustainable economy. And that's, I think, recognized by the financial sector. It's going to be cheaper and more competitive to be sustainable as not to be sustainable. So better look through policy and landscape towards the scientific and technology trends that provide better compass for the way forward. This is what really is needed today, and I think this is where the financial sector is really focusing. So we have to admit that anti-ESG and anti-greenwash pressure have somehow had an impact. I think they have had also the impact of eliminating perhaps the superficial types of considerations that we have had in this debate, and it has also made clear that those active in sustainable finance need to be now more than ever able to make the case of why sustainable and sustainable investment and sustainable finance is the right business rationale for their approach.
Great. So I think, in closing, it's clear you all face a very complex landscape in 2025 and going forward for the coming years. Some would say actually going out to 2050, there will be 4 or 5 or 6 different governments in each democratic jurisdiction. You need to operate in those that are helping and those that are hindering. Your business needs to be based on longer term projection and steering. Challenges, especially around regulatory fragmentation, compliance costs, some ESG pushback. I think seeing through these, the opportunities, the potential for financial institutions in terms of doing good business are considerable. So with that, we'd really like to thank you to get started today, to bring together the discussions of building bridges in UNEP size, Global Roundtable. This is why you're here, to sort through, to understand these trends and to figure out how together we can work on market-centric solutions to drive forward, to drive us towards a sustainable future. Thank you very much and looking forward to today's discussions.
Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. Thank you, Patrick. Let's move on. Let's keep the momentum going. Those key words there, engaged, recognize it's a complex landscape. Focus on the future, not elections. Let's test this in the financial area because we're joined by Rémy Rioux, who's Chief Executive Officer of the AFD Group. He's joining us from Paris. Morning, Rémy. Bonjour. I hope we can hear you as well. I hope you've been hearing what Eric and Patrick have been saying. You are CEO of the Agence Française de Développement, the AFD, but also chair of Finance in Common Summit, the FIX, which is going to be meeting in February in Cape Town, a consortium of 585 development banks. So welcome. How are you building a collaborative global financial architecture? Where do you see the challenge, building on what we've heard from Eric and Patrick?
Good morning, Nick, and good morning, everybody. Sorry, I was with you last year, but for personal reasons, I cannot attend today. And I really want to commend the fantastic work made by UNEP FI and building bridges. Yes, there's an urgency to build bridges between North and South, Baku, public and private. So I'm here to maybe provide the voice of public development banks with you all, to bridge short-term and long-term, to bridge, of course, economic, social, and environmental. This is what SDGs are about. So yes, we launched now back in 2020 this gathering of all the public development banks in the world. We will reconvene in Cape Town at the end of February 26 to 28. Of course, you're all welcome. It's open to all stakeholders. And it will be very interesting because it will be same date, same location as the first meeting of the finance ministers and central bank governors of the G20. Eric was referring to regulation issues, our shareholders, our stakeholders in the room. So I think there's a really a very nice consistency between building bridges, UNEP FI, more I would say on the private side.
But can we talk about the ambitions, Rémy, about the whole of system approach that you're trying to introduce, a collaborative global financial architecture? What's the challenge and how can it be delivered at the speed that's necessary?
So good news is, yes, you mentioned it, about 600 public development banks in the world, so which would really together form a sort of backbone, I would say, a sort of vast, hopefully more efficient and less fragmented architecture of public investment. So in 2024, the MDB engine I think, is up and running, and I really want to commend what President Bonga of the World Bank, President Goldfage, and others are doing with this G20 roadmap. Now the idea is really next year in 2025 to plug the rest of the architecture, meaning mostly national public development banks, so that we can provide the buy-in of the countries and also the capacity to mobilize their own ecosystem in the country. So it means BNDES in Brazil, for instance, DBSA in South Africa, many others. And of course, it's with private investors, developing blended finance, developing financial markets, so that this whole of a public development bank system has really a transformational impact for the financial systems.
But can you be more specific about how to unlock and implement more ambition? What is the ambition, would you say, and how achievable is it?
So we have built a fix lab. So we are working on specific issues. So as Patrick said it, the finalization of Article 6 and carbon markets is, of course, absolutely crucial. And you know, for now, carbon markets are totally private. So we need now to bring, and it was not possible until the negotiation was not finalized. We need to bring the public component to this market infrastructure. We need to animate these markets by originating high quality credits. And this is one of the issues that has been identified between all of us. I remind you that, especially for European partners, that when you invest or when you buy carbon credits in a foreign country, this is in your own performance, so it can ease your own trajectory. So having a global perspective on where to reduce emissions and see where it's the most efficient to do it, it's probably better than to do it in your own small, be it the European Union box. And it can, of course, bring more international cooperation and a global trajectory that will be more, I would say, comprehensive and aligned between all of us. So we're working on carbon market, we're working on debt swaps, you know, many initiatives happening. When we're working on contingent clauses in loan contracts, that's for public, but also for commercial banks. Why not? If a country is hit by a severe catastrophe, we should provide the liquidity somehow by suspending our contracts. And we're also working, it's more tricky and difficult, but very important, on how to ease FX, currency risks, to provide investors more certainty of the value of their...
Now, Rémy, one of the things you've introduced is the FIX Innovation Lab. What is that looking at, and how much is that creating the new agenda for February in Cape Town?
So I just mentioned you the four topics we are precisely working. There's a call for project for all of us that was launched. So support financed by the Children Investment Fund Foundation, our dear friends of CIF. And yes, we need more innovation, especially between public and private. This connection, articulation that is still to be improved. And of course, you know the discussion happening at the level of our leaders, especially about SDR. How could we leverage more issuance of SDR? There are proposals on the table by multilateral development banks. I hope we will make it maybe by February. And you know also the discussion on how to convince our own citizens to provide more concessional resources. And we know we're in time of fiscal constraints, to push our institution to blend finance so that we go in frontier markets where we should reduce emission, where we should reduce vulnerabilities, provide growth, And that's the issue, especially of global levies at the level of the G20.
Rémy,
So,
can I just pause you one moment? We've got about 4 minutes left, and we've got about 500 people in the room. What I'd like to see if anyone wants to ask any questions. There are paddles, there are microphones. Put up your hand, put up a piece of paper, just so I can see whether anyone wants to just ask you any specific points which can help your Cape Town agenda. Anyone quickly? I can't see anybody. Rémy, is there anything more you want to add? And please put up your hand in the next 4 minutes if you'd like to just put a question to Rémy. But going ahead, what would you say the mood is of everything you've talked about, the urgency which we've just been hearing from Eric and Patrick, faced with these headwinds, not just because of physical storms, but political headwinds and so many other headwinds which we were discussing yesterday?
Before that, just invite all of you in the room again to, there is blended finance. I mean, how could we de-risk investments? And that's very important. But you all have to remember that the most obvious and easy way to mobilize private finance is just having the balance sheet of public development banks grow, because we are, of course, blending by nature. We are issuing bonds on the markets that you are buying, and we are investing for climate in frontier markets. So this is the discussion that will take place at the World Bank level, but it's a way wider discussion. And our proposal, of course, to the regulators, to the rating agencies, to the investors, is maybe, you know, there are sovereign bonds on the markets, there are municipal bonds. Maybe we should try to invent a new asset class, a new category of emitters that would be the public development bank's bonds. So if you could help us in this, especially in Cape Town at the end of February, I think that would really make a breakthrough and provide the incentives in the market within our institutions so that we step up. I mean, we increase the quality of our investments, the quality of our procedures, and the articulation with private. And I'm to come back to your point, Nick. I'm really optimistic. We see so many things happening in terms of decarbonization. And I was, like Eric, Patrick, in Baku a few weeks ago. I went to Beijing immediately afterward to see the mood there. And yes, the momentum is still there. The NCQG decision, not only the 300 billion Patrick was referring to, but also the 1.3 trillion Paris-aligned finance, meaning private finance that has to be aligned, is also a goal now for 2035. And we propose to identify a category called transformational finance that would precisely bridge, will be the part of the concessional public resources that would help bridge between public and private, transform institutions, help set the right trajectories.
Now, Rémy, we've got literally 1 minute. So let me ask you about the PDBs as an asset class for connecting private to public investment. Literally 1 minute, if you can.
Sure. I mean, it's already there. I mean, you know, you have about 100 public development banks that are issuing bonds on the market already. But it's 100 only out of about 600. So the question to all of you is, how could we accompany these institutions? Of course, to have the right procedures, to pass the test of market credibility, and then push them to mobilize concessional finance and originate way more bankable projects for your own investments than what we have on the table. So we need this finance in common initiative is really building a vast, efficient machine of origination and co-financing with private for SDGs and to leave no one behind, of course.
All right, Rémy, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Nick.
You've created a very clear framework of ambition and determination and capacity. So thanks very much indeed for joining us from Paris this morning.
Thank you.
So how will finance move to center stage? We've got a recorded intervention here from Makta Diop from the IFC. Let's play the tape.
Hello, everyone. I'm sorry that I can't be in Geneva with you. Switzerland, as you know, is a strong partner of the World Bank Group. It has contributed significantly to our sustainability agenda, supporting the Green Bond Technical Assistance Program and our EDGE initiative for green building. At COP29, negotiation resulted in a new global climate finance target of $300 billion to be mobilized in support of developing countries. To this end, the multilateral development banks announced that by 2030, our annual collective climate financing for low and middle-income countries will reach $120 billion, including $42 billion for adaptation. We also aim to mobilize $65 billion from the private sector. To do this, first we need to build financial institutions that are ready to address the climate crisis and build resilience. Second, we need common frameworks or green taxonomies for market participants to finance green assets and the green transition. IFC has supported the first such taxonomies in Mexico, Ghana, the Philippines, and many other countries. These efforts also extend to blue finance and biodiversity finance. During COP29, in partnership with the Central Bank of Azerbaijan, UNDP, and the EU, we launched the roadmap to encourage interoperability between the growing number of national taxonomies. IFC's roles goes well beyond financing emerging economies. We have contributed in setting standards. In this context, UNEP is a strong partner to implement the roadmap. Third, we need more blended finance, which can de-risk investment and align incentives for greater impact. Fourth, we need to support investors with data to adjust their perception of the risk of investing in developing countries. We have just released decades of data on default and recovery rate for private and sovereign lending in developing countries from the GEMS consortium. Going forward, IFC will focus much more on private capital mobilization and growing our equity business, especially to support the climate transition in middle-income countries. Our private capital mobilization reached a record of $34 billion last year, and we expect to do even more this year. In closing, I want to reiterate that emerging markets require our collective support to prepare not just for the challenges of the climate crisis, but also for the opportunity of climate action. No one entity can do it alone, and certainly not without the private sector. Thank you very much.
Maktar, thank you very much for joining us from the International Finance Corporation. Right, how much of what we're talking about is a human right? How much is there a right? What is the resilience? Let me invite up Mary Robinson and Elisabeth Stern, because for the next 20 minutes we want to engage. You heard from Mary yesterday, who until this year was chair of the elders, and has now moved away and is a very senior figure in the Planetary Guardians, who are very much aligned with Johan Rockström. Elisabeth, you sit in the middle. Oh, all right. And is phenomenally well connected, and particularly as a former Commissioner for Human Rights of the United Nations. And also Elisabeth Stern, who's a board member of the KlimaSeniorinnen. We're going to hear about that in a moment, Elisabeth. But we want to look at the wisdom, the right to a resilient future. And in the next 20 minutes, that's what we want to define before we move on to the next segment of this morning. So welcome, both of you. Mary, we heard from you yesterday, so I'm going to turn to Elisabeth first, although we heard from you right at the end of yesterday, Elisabeth, because many people won't know what KlimaSeniorinnen is. But we need to know what it is, but also this massive case you've been involved in for the last 8 years, underscoring the principles of resilience, which you say are so important.
Good morning, everybody. Yes, the KlimaSeniorinnen, the senior women, Swiss senior women for the protection of the climate, they started as a very small group in some kitchen in Zurich, and they were really frustrated about the climate policy of our country, the emissions, the CO2 emissions, and so on. So they decided to make sure that the country comes up with a better climate policy. And we won that case eventually in April. And since then, we have been on the platform. So what was it about? It's the link between climate protection of climate change is a human right. That was one point. And the other one is climate change or extreme weather conditions due to climate change have a great effect, a negative effect on human health, and specifically that of senior women. Maybe that's for the moment.
And what do you think you've established by the success of your case? It's been a Trojan battle you've had for the last 8 years.
Yes, it was an uphill battle because you have to go through your national courts first before you can end up at the European Court for Human Rights in Strasbourg. So in Switzerland we were dismissed 3 times for reasons that for us were sometimes, to put it mildly, just funny. Yes. Like, for instance, I give you one example. Well, 1.5 degrees global warming hasn't been reached yet. So you cannot complain about your health problem because there is still time to reach that. Now, first of all, we know the trouble we have at 1.2 global warming right now, 1.2. And the limit, according to the Paris Agreement, or what we all as a world community agreed upon with that Paris Agreement, is 1.5 degrees, not to go over that. But we see the trouble we have at 1.2. So then, and another argument was everybody suffers, not just you older women, because at that time there were not that many studies out showing that senior women suffer the most. And so they said everybody suffers, including winter tourism. And then we thought, what? They put the life and so the life-threatening issues of people actually dying. I mean, some of those climate policies, or we know the high emissions, they actually kill people. So they put that on the same bar with winter tourism.
Let me press you on the point of principle that you've established, the right to life and health under different articles, and also changing the narrative as well.
Yes. So the different articles, probably Mary can say more about that on the human rights side, but Article 2 and 8 are the ones that stipulate the right to life, the right to health. And those are the 2 articles that we specifically complained about. Okay, what was the other question?
And the
narrative.
The narrative.
Yes.
You've changed the narrative on this.
So you can imagine at the beginning what was the narrative, what do these old folks want anyway, what they complain. They are the boomers, they created all the problem. What is it now? And this has changed over the years. I must say we are receiving a lot of respect now. Some of those old prejudices resurrected itself because the Swiss government is now not adhering to the ruling, but we maybe can talk about that later again.
Well, Mary, let's build on what you were saying yesterday and build on what we've just heard from Elisabeth about the right to a resilient future at this time of marking human rights.
Well, first of all, happy International Human Rights Day, everyone, 10th of December. It's nice to be back in Geneva, and it reminds me a special memory. 27 years ago, I was a new UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. I'd taken over in September, and I realized that 1998 was going to be the 50th anniversary. And so I went to South Africa because President, and he was president at the time, Nelson Mandela, agreed that he would help me to launch this 50th anniversary year, and he would also launch the South African Plan of Action for Human Rights. And we did that this day 27 years ago. It seems like another era, doesn't it? But it isn't. the human rights we're talking about are as important today as they were 27 years ago, as they were in 1948.
Are they as under threat?
They are under more threat and different kinds of threat. But we know in the human rights community it's very often a struggle. This is not new. Countries don't always go forward seamlessly. You know, if you look, for example, at women's rights in the United States at the moment, it's really frightening to see what some states are doing. I can't believe it, because in Ireland we have moved forward and we've opened up and we've made progress. We even removed the ban on abortion in our constitution in a referendum, which was very hard to do. But I'm so pleased about this case because, as Elisabeth said, it has established that protection against climate change is a human right, and in particular the health dimensions of that for older women. And Elisabeth, I want to ask you a question, because I never thought of Switzerland as being a great country for gender equality and gender standing up. And how did these older women, grannies like myself, do it? Tell me.
Well, you're certainly right that we are not a visionary country in terms of gender and women. And you know that we got the vote, the women's vote, very late. So my generation has a lot of practice in practicing patience. Yes. Yeah. So how about we? Yes, you are right. At the beginning, we senior women, we really got the rap. As I said at the beginning, what do they want anyway? But for some reason, at some point, it shifted. Some people remembered, specifically the young ones, oh, they could be my grandmother, and my grandmother is actually a nice person. Maybe they are nice. One thing. And the other is that these women were activists all their lives. We have been in the peace movement, the environmental movement, as it was first called. We wanted to rescue all sorts of high plateaus in Switzerland that were meant for the military. We wanted to end hunger within 20 years, so we were never modest. And I think maybe that was the reason. And then when the young activists came on, they just loved us from the very beginning. And we liked them, and we got together. And
let me encourage anyone else in the next 8 or 9 minutes to come in. So put up your hand and let's get a number to you, because we'd like, if you'd like to engage in what we've heard from Elisabeth and what we're hearing from Mary as well. So put your hand up. Don't leave it too late. Don't back-end load it. There's a hand going up there already. Mary, just picking up on what we've heard there. How much is this, what we've heard from Elisabeth, very frankly, about attitudes here in Switzerland until very recently, how much is that something which is still pervading so much of the world?
I think there is a lot of genuine human rights activism in so many countries. When I served as High Commissioner, when I used to go to the most difficult countries, to Colombia at the time, or Goma in the Democratic Republic of Congo, or whatever, I would come back energized because I would meet people on the ground
and
who
now
were fighting for the rights. And I think it's still the case. A lot of the the fight of young climate activists is a very human rights one, because we do it for climate justice. We see the injustice of climate change. I'm a latecomer to understanding the impacts of climate and human rights together, the connection, because I didn't make any speech about climate during my 7 years as President of Ireland, from 1990 to 97. When I was in the UN, another part of the UN was dealing with it. I didn't connect it with my huge portfolio of human rights, gender equality, rights of indigenous peoples, rights of people with disabilities. Didn't make the connection. It was when I worked in Africa afterwards for my small NGO on economic and social rights, and I saw in 2003, 2004, 2005, women saying to me, is God punishing us? I don't understand what's happening. The rainy seasons aren't coming, or we've had a long period of drought and then flash flooding. It's destroyed our whole village. It's destroyed the school. What is happening?
In retrospect, if you, as your time as President of Ireland, how would it have resonated? And we're talking now 20 years ago. How would it have resonated if you had raised it, given what we've just heard about Switzerland?
I think there would have been well, maybe that's a thing of the future. And that's the difference now. I mean, I wrote a book on climate justice in 2016, and I had to struggle to find examples The two examples in America were the hurricane, what do you call the hurricane in south of
in New Orleans.
Yes, New Orleans, and also in Alaska, the crumbling of houses and no money in a rich country to help people with the erosion from sea level. And in Europe, it was the Sami people and a wonderful Sami woman, young climate activists.
In the Arctic Circle.
Now, I wouldn't have any trouble. Look what happened in Spain very recently, the intense flooding all over. It's happening, and that's why this case is so important, and that it was seen as a human rights issue.
Let me take that one stage further. We're talking about the right to a resilient future, a resilient future. That means resistant to the enormous risks we're now facing.
Actually,
is that under threat?
Yeah, the right that is growing and growing, I'm very glad to say, is the right to a healthy environment. It's a right that is increasingly recognized at the national level, in constitutions, in laws. It's also increasingly at regional level, and we're trying to get it fully. It actually has been recognized by the UN General Assembly, the right to a healthy environment. The Strasbourg court just saw it in terms of, as you said, Article 2 and Article 8 on family life, because it's very specific. But the fact that it recognized as a human right was really important.
Let's get a contribution here. Keep it quick, please. Anyone else?
Pavan Sukhdev, Just Impact. Elisabeth, in your case against the Swiss government is the defendant, but I'm wondering, what about the invisible co-defendant, the ones who cause the externalities, which is the emissions of oil and gas companies and agriculture and so on? How does the private sector reflect in your campaign, and will it?
All right, hold that one moment. Over to number 2, please. And there's someone further back. Number 2, let's hear what you want to say.
Hi, I'm Finlay from the Villars Institute. Where do you think we can actually go after this ruling? So how specifically do we keep the momentum going? And secondly, how do we combat nationalist pushback against the ruling of these supranational courts?
Elisabeth.
Well, against the pushback, just keep talking about it. We are still out on the street in every corner of the country talking about the case. And in that sense, creating the space for this implementation, for the implementation of this ruling, which definitely has to happen.
Mary.
May I just come back to something that was said before? There were two things. This human rights issue is debated all over again, and the fact is that actually the convention, the European Convention of the Human Rights, was written exactly to include future societal issues. Now, by the way, it even has gone so far with the so-called Maastricht principles, and also one of the court cases in Germany that actually extends the right for a healthy life into the future, for future generations, for future harm. And that I find incredible.
Mary.
Yeah, maybe if I could take the point, first of all, of the oil and gas companies, the causing of the problem. There have been cases, and I think increasingly those cases will be more important, because one of the problems is to establish causality. And more we're able to do that. We're able to show that it is fossil fuel that's causing the problem. That's important. I think some courts have made the mistake of, when the litigation starts, they start debating the science. They shouldn't do that. The science is clear. It's understood. It's given. It shouldn't be an argument in court. That's a problem. But I think increasingly climate litigation will be important in moving us forward in jerks, if you like. That's what court cases can do.
Let me just hear from number 1, please. Go ahead. You've got the microphone.
Hello. Dawn Slevin from ELS Europe. I'm an environmental consultant and have worked in this field for 30 years. And human rights, not one of my personal areas that I worked in, but we have minimum safeguards, highly important. And when I think of human rights, I think of it holistically. I don't put it down to one source. I don't look at climate as being the source of human rights. I look at human behaviour as being the source of human rights. And so when any conversation comes up with it, I have to bring up the topic of what we see happening to the lives of children next door to Europe, in the Middle East, and ask you, how can we not bring this into the conversation? We talk about habitation and the right for health for all people across the world, and this is a global conversation.
Thank you.
And I really feel it's important that we bring this into conversation about what's happening in Gaza and now in Damascus and in all of the countries around the Middle East that have been torn apart by international ignoring of this.
In your answer, try and give a message which everyone can take forward as a point of principle from this session.
Yeah. I think your question is really very important because sadly what is happening is there is not full respect by those countries who talk about being democracies and leading in human rights. They don't in some cases, and this is really serious at the moment, and Gaza is a specific example of it. From the beginning of the terrible attacks by Hamas of the 7th of October of last year, the elders that I'm involved with, we saw a disproportionate response by Israel, and from the beginning called on those countries providing arms to Israel to not provide those arms, to restrain. Unfortunately, that has not happened, and that is a failure because it's very clear from the laws of those countries, they should not provide arms where international humanitarian law is being breached. And then added to that, when the International Criminal Court indicted Putin, the West, particularly the United States, praised and said this was very important. But when Netanyahu and the defense minister were indicted, they tried to rubbish this. This is what is really eroding respect for human rights in a way that I'm very worried about. It's very, very important. And in fact, it's very important in Switzerland that the Swiss government fully respect the Court of Human Rights.
Let's have a final word from Elisabeth. You can see we're time out at the moment. What kind of corner do you believe has been turned with your case, which can be reflected both in Switzerland but also more broadly in Europe and around the world? Quickly, if you can.
Very quickly. I think what really has been turned, that the link between human rights, climate protection, climate change has been established. That's one thing. The second one is states do have a responsibility to protect its citizens from the adverse effects of climate change. That has been very clearly established. I would so much like to ask Mary a question which goes in another direction. Do I have time for that, Nick?
Probably not, but we won't tell anyone. The clock
Mary,
has
is
stopped.
something I always wanted to know, and it came up with this whole financial sector discussion that, in my view, is just moving so terribly slowly and everybody feels they are restrained. What is actually the degree of free decision you could take when you were a president or in any sort of a really leadership function? How much do you have to follow what is given, even higher up, or how much do you have to actually act freely?
Mary, you're among friends here, so you can be honest.
Actually, you don't have as much freedom to act as you think you would like to have, but it needs collective standing up by leaders. I think we're in a perilous moment at the moment where the country that was seen as being the champion of democracy and human rights is now denying the science and, under the prospective, rather aggressive leadership that President Trump is promising the world, that is scaring CEOs, I know, making them scared about ESG, about DEI. We need to stand up for our human rights. What is the alternative? What is the alternative? It is the triumph of greed and the bullying of the big boys in our world. It's more important than ever that we understand the value of what was created, the whole structures that have been created that are so, so important. International rule of law, international protection of human rights, and it's because we want to protect from what is happening. And there is an inhumanity in what is happening in Gaza, what is happening in Sudan, which is the biggest case of civilians being killed or suffering severe famine in Sudan. We don't even talk about it. So we really need to re-energize, and let's use this International Human Rights Day to reflect on how important it has been, what we have built up over the years. And let's talk more about climate justice. Let's talk more about the link between the injustice of climate, the injustice that affects the poorest countries, poorest communities, small island states, and indigenous peoples much earlier and much more severely, that within that there's a real gender dimension, and then the injustice to nature. I really appreciate that there is more interest now in addressing the importance of regenerating and protecting nature from what is happening. And I'm part of the Guardians, as you mentioned, Nick, that Johan Rockström spoke about, his health check. We are in a perilous moment, and we need to stand up and understand that the greatest achievement has been international human rights, international rule of law, multilateral agreements, even if they don't reach the state we'd like. Those agreements are important because they move us forward. And we've got to re-energize ourselves and stand up for these issues.
I'm very reluctant to have to bring this to a close, but thank you both very much indeed for laying out so clearly and so vividly some very important points of principle. So thank you both very much indeed. And I'm going to invite Raj Kumar, who's founder and president of DevEx, to come up here, because we want to move forward on how finance is driving the sustainability agenda. Raj. Thank you. Well done. I think you've got half the audience here.
Okay, good morning. Good morning. Nice to be with all of you. I'm Raj Kumar. I'm the president and editor-in-chief at DevEx. It is always tough to follow Mary Robinson, and as usual, she, I think, laid it out just right for us, the stakes. And I saw her wearing an SDG pin. I see a lot of people in this audience, including people on this panel, wearing that Sustainable Development Goal pin. And it reminds me, I was actually there when they ratified the Sustainable Development Goals in 2015. I was on a stage somewhat like this, moderating a session with fellow journalists who were asking some leaders about what do these Sustainable Development Goals actually mean. And one of my panelists was Bill Gates at the time. And toward the end of the session, a journalist said, they're estimating that to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, we will need hundreds of billions of new dollars per year, maybe up to trillions of new dollars per year. Is any of this really realistic? And Bill Gates looked a bit annoyed by the question, and he answered with just 3 words. He said, "What about innovation?" And I've thought a lot about that since then, and the truth is, even in 2015, when we had 0 interest rates, before the Brexit referendum, before the election of President Trump, before the election certainly of 2024, even then we knew we needed the private sector. But now it is abundantly clear that we need the private sector, that innovation has to be driven by maybe the people on this stage with me. If global development in the last century was about engineers literally building bridges, literally doing civil engineering work, I think this century's development is about financial engineering. And as we've heard, some of it has moved a lot slower than we need, But there is progress. We're going to get into today what it takes and where we are. Maybe it's not just engineers, maybe it's actually sustainability officers, because we've got a panel of chief sustainability officers from around the world who are going to tell us sort of how they are doing on aligning finance with sustainability goals. And I just want to get us going into a conversation, if I can, along those lines. And maybe I'll start with you, Anja, if I can. Anja Hanneres is the Chief Sustainability Officer of Nordea. And we've heard a little bit of reference already this morning to this issue, and I know yesterday it was brought up quite a bit. But the truth is, the world in many ways is relying on the financial sector. And you have to think out into a different time frame than maybe political actors do. You have to worry about whether projects you finance today will be resilient, will be able to survive in a very different era, in a warming planet. So how are you thinking about this and working at this as someone who's come your entire career out of the finance sector?
Sorry. Well, Nordea, the bank where I work, is the biggest financial institution in the Nordics. We have about 500,000 corporate customers and some 10 million private customers. And we have worked in this Nordic region for about 200 years, supporting local societies in different stages of societal change. So the sustainability transition is the most urgent and pressing change that we're seeing right now. And this makes it really simple for us to define our why. And we see it in 3 different parts. So the first one is the corporate transition. This is how we support corporate customers in their transition planning. We provide finance supporting their transition and advice that incentivize their movement in their transition. So that's the first step. The second one is then the impacts the corporate transition has on our private customers and the public in the markets where we work. So this means the people who are employed in our corporate customers, who buy and are reliant on the services and products of the companies that we work with. So we support their financial well-being by pushing the transition for corporates. And we can also incentivize our private customers through green mortgages, energy efficiency loans, and sustainable savings options. So that's the 2 focus areas for us in our business. And then, of course, if we advise and support our customers in becoming more resilient to climate change and to nature degradation and the impacts that might have on their financial status, that, of course, lowers our inherent risk as a bank and makes us more attractive as an investment, gives us more opportunity to actually be the catalyst in providing finance towards the green transition. So we call this a win-win-win. It's good for our customers, it's good for society, and it's good for us as a bank.
And it is good business for you, even now, not just good business in the long run. Is that right?
No, absolutely. It's a huge opportunity. And it's because it's really simple. It's not rocket science. We work with our customers in making these incremental steps every day in improving their sustainable performance. And that's what we do best in managing their risks and thereby managing our own risks.
Thomas, maybe I can get you into the discussion on this point. Thomas Broccoli is the head of sustainability at Siemens Financial Services. You're sort of the B2B financing arm of the giant conglomerate that is Siemens. And you're thinking in these terms too, especially given the work Siemens does around the transition and helping companies transition. Is this kind of offering that you have, which is similar to Nordea in a way, is it mostly an ESG drive, or is it really just a business proposition from your perspective? Or are those 2 things really no different now in 2024?
So thank you very much for having me. I think when coming to Siemens Financial Services as the captive financing arm of Siemens, the technology company, technology plays a role. Technology is the business, yeah? And now I think when we comes to the challenges of our times, we know that for most of the challenges, for most of the levers that are kind of making the net zero transition happening, we have the technology. They already exist. So think about renewable energy increase, think about electrification, think about energy efficiency. These are the 3 key levers by the IEA. Most of the technologies are there. Oftentimes it's about the financing and also the customized financing for our customers. So in the end, coming to your question, it's a sweet spot where business and sustainability comes together. So for us, sustainability business is profitable business in the long term, and we do see huge opportunities in the whole field of sustainability.
I think this is one reason why people, maybe even some in this room who work in this space, are frustrated by the pace, right? Because they see such an obvious gap. There's all of this money on the sidelines. There's trillions of dollars in pension funds and savings ready to be invested. There are technologies that can help companies transition. There are renewable energy and other kinds of energy efficiency technologies. And somehow yet, bringing those 2 things together turns out to be slow and painstaking and hard. Why is that?
I mean, this is, I think, the biggest challenge, yeah? To accelerate this, I think what is required clearly is a level playing field, yeah? So things like global standards, global frameworks, a level playing field for kind of banks like Odier or all the others. We are global banks. We're operating in more than 60 countries, yeah? So it is required to have a level playing field, also to allow these risk-sharing mechanisms Rémy kind of mentioned in the previous session. I think this is key. We are progressing, but all the political developments currently are not very stringently directing in one direction. Let's put it like that.
Yeah, and that makes it hard, right? Because we're talking about market mechanisms, and when there's uncertainty, when there isn't one clear standard, you can see how it's hard for a market to start to move. And maybe we can get into the specific example of the construction sector with you, Antonio Carrillo, who's the Vice President of Sustainability at Holcim. Construction is one of the biggest polluting sectors in the world, also one of the biggest opportunities, and something your company has leaned a lot into. But it makes me think of Thomas's point about a level playing field. Because if there isn't a level playing field, you know, the bar can be lowered, and people can say, well, I can build cheaper if I don't build in a sustainable way. How do you think about that as a business that's thinking long term?
Yeah, thank you, Raj. So indeed, the built environment, as we call it, is responsible for, I think it's well known, 37% of global greenhouse emissions. It's actually interesting to see that when you look at the differences, only 10% is associated to the direct emissions of building materials, and 27% is about the energy that those buildings consume.
The operating costs, right? The lights and everything else.
Absolutely. So you have really like a fragmented value chain that policies are not always tackling at the right pace. So you have a very fragmented value chain within the built environment, but you also have a very fragmented value chain in the way that regulation works. I couldn't agree more with Thomas about the play level field, especially when it comes to carbon markets. Obviously, you have Europe where the EU ETS has been decades being improved, being fine-tuned, and to get into a regulation scheme with the European Innovation Funds, there's a lot of governmental approach. And there are other markets where those regulations are not that much advanced. I think what this needs is companies to take the courage to really have decarbonization roadmaps at the heart of the strategies and to push. There's a lot of innovations, and I would agree with Thomas, there's a lot of innovation that require financing, and for that there are plenty of mechanisms, ESG-linked bonds, green bonds, et cetera, et cetera. There are other innovations that you could actually achieve with own capital that actually bring good avoided costs, and also expanded margins in the market. I think in general, it is a fact that built environment is one of the main contributors to those externalities or impacts, but it's also one of the main sectors that are actually driving the agenda towards building better with less. I think this building is one of the examples how we used to build in the past. Probably we will not build the same building these days.
I think that's right, and the other reason it's so important, and this building is a good example, is the built environment lasts a long time. So the decisions you make now are going to be with us a very long time, and that's why getting the market right. I know Patrick talked about it in the beginning, and he and Eric have said, you know, in some ways, this political moment is just a moment, and we're looking much beyond it. But on the other hand, there's a lot that will happen right now that will determine how much we are emitting in the future. Shargil, maybe I can get you into the discussion now. Shargil Bashir is the Chief Sustainability Officer and Executive Vice President at the First Abu Dhabi Bank. And maybe you could just tell us more about your region. Obviously, you come from a region where there's a lot of fossil fuel production. You're banking and financing in that region. How are you thinking about the energy transition at the regional level when you deal with sectors like the fossil fuel industry?
Thank you, Raj, for the question. Thank you very much for having me. So I think in the region, when we look at the Middle East, is definitely transitioning. We saw back in 2021, UAE was the first country in the region that committed to net zero, was the first country to ratify the Paris Agreement back in 2016. So a lot of focus has been going into transitioning. We saw this also at COP28 when the UAE came together, showed the leadership and tried to bring together and got the UAE consensus agreement, which was, transitioning away from fossil fuels as well, which is a significant step to take when you are from a fossil fuel economy. And we've also seen since, for the past 10 years, the growth in the region and the investment going to the renewable energy as well. When you think about it today, one of the top 5 biggest companies in the world in renewable energy is from Abu Dhabi, which is Masdar. So we are seeing significant investments going into sustainability and renewable energy. I think the region has a very clear direction that you want to continue being the energy leader in the future as well. That energy will not be fossil fuel, but will be renewable energy. So what is it that we do? And as it was mentioned, a lot of investments are going into innovation. We are seeing hydrogen plants being built in the region as well to taking those steps from that perspective. We've seen the growth significantly happening in the renewable energy. So if we go back 10 years, the renewable energy level in the region was around 1 gigawatt, and the ambition is to be above 100 gigawatt by end of 2030 and continue significant investments in that. So the transition is happening away from fossil fuel, but we also need to remember that it's not an on-off button, right? We can't just say that, we just take away fossil fuel overnight and suddenly we're just gonna move into renewable energy world. It doesn't happen like that. So that transition is required, and as we have seen with the geopolitical situations over the past couple of years, we also need to ensure energy security as well, which is a very important topic as well. So how do we ensure that we can transition to more sustainable and renewable energy, but in a secure, in a sustainable way? And that takes investments where the financial industries has a key role to play. And it also takes collaboration between the public sector and private sector coming together to say that how can this transition look like, because the financial sector cannot do it by itself. We also need the policymakers to come and support from that perspective. And I think that we are really seeing the willingness and leadership in the region to say that that transition needs to happen, and we as policymakers are here to support that transition. And I think that hopefully we will see more and more regions moving into that direction, and where the policymakers can start supporting that transition.
I think it's a good point that a lot of the action can be at the regional level, because very often you're talking about energy markets that operate regionally. Of course, there are some countries big enough, but often these are regional questions. And if you have the right policy environment at the regional level, if you have the right kind of business investment and platforms like the ones that are representing us today, the Building Bridges platform and the UNEP FI, there is a chance to actually create that market and move it forward. Maybe the same thing applies to insurance. Claudine Blamy is with us, the Chief Sustainability Officer at Aviva. Insurance was sort of maybe the sleepy backwater for a long time in this discussion, and now I think it's the front, it's the vanguard, because so much of what we're talking about really are questions of insurance, that we know what the risks are going to be, or we have a sense of what they are. How do we protect against them? Well, it's the tools of insurance that are increasingly talked about in this context. So where are we in that conversation from your perspective?
Good question. Yeah, I'd agree. I think the insurance sector, compared to the investment world, hasn't been talked about as much. Although I do think there's been a lot of work going on in this space. We own risk, right? We understand risk. And this is about, a lot of this is about risk management. Whether it's your own operational risks within your own companies, we've heard some of that today, or in terms of risk, in terms of climate impacts, which we're seeing more and more of. So it's impacting our business today. Flood risks, they're increasing. We think, according to our models, will be increasing 0 to 4% every year, year on year. So you can imagine that that's going to have an impact on insurance pricing. It's going to have an impact on claims, and it's going to have an impact. We've seen in the US, a lot of countries the insurers have pulled out of because actually they can't measure that risk. That risk just doesn't work anymore for them.
And that 0.4% is probably not an average. It's an average across the world.
It's an average.
But there will be places where it's very concentrated, and some of those are places with very high value real estate.
Yeah, exactly. So I think on the other side of the coin of that is that we have to work with the companies that are our clients or individuals that are our clients, which we're doing so already, thinking about how do we make them more resilient and actually stopping that risk of claim becoming a risk of claim in the first place. I think that's what we're trying to do. We've got lots of examples of that that we've done, working on with technology, on understanding how much flood there will be in that area, and when that flood increases a certain amount, the insurance is paid out automatically. And those are the sorts of things we can start to think about, as well as working with areas that are high flood risks and preventing that flood from happening in the first place, or if it does happen, preventing the damage being too much. And we've seen about 64% decrease in those claims where we have done that kind of thing. Working on the investment side as well, because we have we're a big investor, £376 billion worth of investment. Again, it becomes about stewardship, really working with those organisations to really understand them. No point in completely disinvesting and saying that that's what we're going to do, because that's just paper decarbonisation. And so really working on those, and we have disinvested in some cases. We have policies around this where more than 5% of organisations' revenue is from thermal coal, for example. We have given chances to those organisations. We have worked with them, but where they breach that, we have disinvested.
And are those policies that are unique to Aviva, or we've heard a little bit about the need for this industry-wide standards and a level playing field, or are you looking to other regulatory bodies or voluntary bodies to say, well, that's a standard they've set? If there's more than 5% of revenue from thermal coal, we can't fund them.
I think we were one of the first to do that. We are still, I think, the only financial organisation who have an ambition to be net zero by 2040. So we've been pushing the agenda a lot harder, I think, than some others out there. But I think it's becoming the norm now, where there are exclusion policies in place. What I would love to see is governments having transition plans. Because once those transition plans are in place from a national level, then you can start to see, okay, so what do I do in my sector to respond to that transition plan? And I think that's what's missing at the moment.
And I guess I wonder, Anya, you brought this up earlier, the idea of getting everyone aligned, which is obviously what building bridges is all about. Why does it matter? If this is a comparative advantage for Nordea or for Aviva, isn't it better for you to just go it alone and say, we're going to be even tougher than our competitors on this, or we're going to go further out on the risk curve? Well, why is it important that this becomes something aligned across the industry?
Well, it's because, yes, we are competitors in a way, but in this work we are partners. We share the same long-term ambition, and therefore we need to work together. And the question of level playing field, I think, is super relevant, and definitely both in the European Nordic versus rest of Europe context, but also Europe versus the rest of the world. Harmonization of standards and what kind of impacts the new regulations such as CSRD might have on European companies and their competitiveness, that's of course really high on the agenda. But, and I said to you earlier, is this a dream world, this global harmonization, standardization? Can we really achieve it? And I really hope that we can, but in the meantime, we cannot be inactive and wait for that to happen. So we need to take the steps. We need to just accept where we are in the transition and start from there. And that reflects our strategy towards our customers. We support customers in different stages of transition, not just the final steps to get to net zero. And we recognize that some companies, they are not mature and ready to make a long-term commitment, but they can still do things. And in some instances, the first steps on the transition are the ones that really have a positive impact on emissions. So for us, it's about bringing the society and the societal transition with us and the value chain transition, not just cleaning our own balance sheet, but getting everyone along. And that's why it's so important that we collectively have this view that we really want to not gain a competitive advantage by pushing the problem over to someone else, but by doing this and really having an impact on the economy.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that you think about it both at the customer you have, but also their customers, and trying to reach all the way through that value chain, which is where you get significant economic change. What do you think, Antonio, of this idea? We don't want to make the perfect the enemy of the good. That, you know, yes, you might know what the perfect construction, net zero construction approach might be, but not everyone is there yet. It might be hard to finance that. Do you think in similar terms about there are steps we can take today that are more realistic?
I really think so. I think in our sector, we've seen, I mean, Holcim, we want to believe we've been a first mover in having, for example, science-based target aligned with the 1.5 in 2030, in 2050, the launch of low-carbon cement and concrete around 2020. It's not that far ago, and today those represent a good percentage of our global net sales in the order of 25% for both segments. We've seen how our competitors have actually gone the same direction, and I mean, it's obviously good to have a first move in this landscape. It brings a competitive advantage, but it's also good that everyone follows, so it really create a mainstream. Otherwise, it really gets an issue. We're talking here about drastically changing the way we do business, and for that you really need a scale.
Where does the demand come from, though? I mean, green concrete is much more expensive. Your customers, it sounds like, are demanding that now from you and from your competitors. Yep. Why? What's driving them to spend more?
Two things happen here. One is one of a false kind of understanding is producing low carbon or more circular not always is more expensive, because you do a lot of, I mean, at least we reuse a lot of wasted resources from other industries. Sometimes we even get paid to manage those waste streams that we can actually repurpose in our production lines to basically reduce extraction of virgin materials. That actually helps us to reduce costs. And there is a premium in the market that our customers are willing to pay. The premium, where is it coming from? You have mainly two or three streams. One is you have first movers also down the value chain. We're talking about real estate or even the techs, especially in North America. They're willing to reduce their Scope 3 emissions that potentially come mainly from the concrete they use in the data centers. So they're willing to actually pay a fee for having a lower carbon concrete or building material that is actually reflected with an EPD. That's another important aspect on the certification of this kind of carbon footprint through environmental product declarations. And then you also have labels that apply also for buildings, like LEED, BREEAM, that actually require this sort of certification, and eventually it's kind of a blockchain system. You are very clear on what actually you're buying and what's going to be the footprint of the full building when actually it concludes. So these, I would say, are the main two kind of streams that actually bring demand. There are also coalitions, partnerships, I think is being mentioned. First Mover Coalition, they try to connect these dots in the value chain and endorse some of these requirements, and obviously we're part of that as well. I think is a good initiative, so actually connect the dots.
It's a good example where even with all the ESG backlash, even with the lack of a level playing field, the private sector can do a lot, right? So you're talking about companies that have a lot of the big tech companies, for example, that have said, we make a commitment, Now, why are they making that? They believe it, their employees demand it, their customers demand it, and so they say, we're gonna make a commitment to this. Then they spend more for green concrete. That helps build a market for it. It allows companies like yours to develop that market. So there is real potential, even in a moment when there's a lot of backsliding on these topics. Thomas, what's your thought about this?
I completely agree, and I just wanted to pick up one topic you mentioned. So I think exclusion is important, yeah, and we also do have exclusions. What works, I think, in at least in internal conversations with the colleagues from the business better is seeing the opportunities. So there are lots of investment requirements needed, yeah. It was mentioned in today's first session, kind of studies from the IAE talking about trillions, yeah, on building up renewable energy capacity. The European Union has a very ambitious plan to come to net zero, which requires a lot of investments. So there is a lot of investment opportunities. So not talking about what we do not do as a business, but also talking about what we can do and what we actually need to do, need to accelerate in providing financing for. And climate action, it's clearly about decarbonizing energy, the energy system. Yeah, it's about decarbonizing, we call them hard to abate industries. Pretty sure you all know them. Concrete is one topic. Yeah, steel is another. So humanity will not have the same living standard without these kind of very important industries. But they are hard to abate. Yeah, and helping kind of these industries to produce steel, to produce cement based on with low carbon technologies. I think this is key. The third one is decarbonized transportation. We see it in our private lives, but also kind of on a broader level. Electrification of rail, of public transport, of private transport. These are huge investment fields. So I rather tend to focus more on the investment opportunities than what we're not going to finance, but both are equally important. So I'm totally with you. Yeah.
Well, and I think by excluding some kinds of companies or some kinds of investments, it could, in theory, push those businesses to say, well, the cost of financing for me is higher because I can't get these kinds of capital sources. So I should be willing to seize some of those opportunities, at least in theory. But that's where the level playing field, I guess, is important. Maybe we could talk a little bit renewable energy in that context. You brought it up, Shargil, so maybe, it seems like I sit on these panels and hear people say, solar is now cheaper, including places like Abu Dhabi, which has significant solar capacity. It's now cheaper than incremental fossil fuel. And yet, there still is tremendous fossil fuel exploration and production happening all over the world. So what is missing there? Is it a financing gap? Is it something else?
I think, first of all, we just need to recognize that renewable energy capacity globally is not at an equal level. When we look at the global south versus global north, the capacity isn't nowhere near where it needs to be. And also, the usage of energy in global south is nowhere near of global north, right? I think there was a recent study that concluded that in Africa, usage of energy per individual is around 20% compared to global north, right? And we know that the energy demand is only going to increase as well, right?
In many ways, energy is development.
Exactly. So first of all, I think that's the challenge we need to recognize, that we need more energy and we need less emissions, right? And I think that's the combination we need to find in a good way to say that how can we ensure that we make more and more energy available at the same time that we keep reducing emissions. So, and again, it's absolutely right that we need to invest significantly more in renewable energy, whether being solar, wind, hydrogen, etc. Even nuclear energy is being invested in now significantly as well. Might play a role. And at the same time, we need to make sure, because as I said, it's not an on and off right now, right? Because if we just turned off fossil fuel tonight, tomorrow morning, imagine billions of people will not be able to continue their daily life. That's the fact. So we need to ensure that even the fossil fuels that are being used right now needs to reduce emission as much as possible, right? So that's also a path until we build enough renewable energy capacity globally to ensure that we can make this transition in a good and sustainable way.
I think there would be a lot of agreement with that, but I also think a lot of people say, well, why are we building more fossil fuel capacity right now?
Absolutely.
right?
Yeah, and I think that's where it's important that for how much money goes into fossil fuel, 3, 4, 5, 10 times more needs to go into renewable energy, right? So as an example, as us for First Abu Dhabi Bank, back in 2022, we set a target that we wanted to facilitate more than $75 billion into sustainable finance by 2030. At COP28, we increased that target to $135 billion. And just to put that in context, that's 50% of the commitment made by the UAE banking sector. Of that, we have achieved around 40% in the first 2 years. So the demand is there, and we are able to provide that financing. And a lot of our peers, is not unique to FAB, a lot of our peers are making financing available for renewable energy. And that's why, and even more needs to be made available, right? And we also need to many more of those projects coming through as well. And again, coming back to my previous point, a bit of support from the policymakers will help as well, right? Because right now, some of the challenges we face on hydrogen projects, as an example, very long-term projects, right now, they're simply not bankable because the business case simply doesn't add up, and we are, again, regulated, so we can't just go and provide all the financing and have a very wide risk appetite as well. So help from policymakers in supporting that transition and making those kind of investments easier for banks to make is going to help significantly. So I think, again, with getting that support from the policymakers as saying, getting the alignment of the global standards harmonization will help significantly. Because right now, a big part of the world, investing $100 in coal versus $100 in renewable energy, same capital allocation, right? I know it's not the case everywhere in Europe, but in the big part of the world, Global South, that's still the case. So until we start changing that you incentivize to invest more and more in renewable energy, we're not going to see that big transition happening as fast as we would like it to happen.
In some ways, the policy might even be making it worse, right? You have a lot of subsidies for fossil fuel. You might have tariffs for solar panels. You know, in some ways, it might be cheaper to put 100 into coal than 100 into renewable today in some places. And policy, if it just got out of the way for things like green hydrogen or made a level playing field, might make a big difference.
It will make a huge difference. It will make a huge difference. And I think that's one of the challenges, because a lot of the policies, so we are trying to go through this huge transition, while a lot of the policies we are working under were made decades ago, right? And haven't been renewed, and I think, or rethought. And I think that's also very important that we align that. And I think the point that was made earlier, we need these government transition plans, because that's so critical that we have governments that are basically showing the transition. How are they going to transition towards 2050, and how are they going to align to 1.5 degree? Right? And once we have that, we can, as a private sector, finance sector, really go and support and say, here is a very clear outline, here's a very clear direction from our policymakers, from the governments on their transition. How can we go and make the financing available and support that transition in a good and a sustainable way?
We've heard the word investable projects, bankable projects. Do you have a similar issue with insurable projects, Claudine? In other words, you know, is it that there aren't enough things out there that meet your kind of requirements for sustainability, for resilience, that you would want to then go and insure? Is there a market forming that's needed at this point? Or is it more that there's not enough capital to chase after these opportunities?
There's huge amounts of opportunity, and in fact, we're one of the biggest renewable insurers in the UK. Offshore wind, we've been insuring the offshore wind projects in the UK, and it's hard for insurers. It's hard because it's about thinking. Well, I suppose it's hard for everybody, thinking about whole new business models, because this is what this is about. But I just want to pick up on this point of transition planning and why that's really important for us as well as an insurer. I think it's important because we talked about systems in the last panel, and unless you have someone thinking about the whole system, you'll end up with huge amount of unintended consequences. So if you just take fossil fuels on its own, or if you just take renewables on its own, you will end up with those unintended consequences, like damage to nature, which we want to protect and restore and become even more positive in. So and land management, and how do you do that? Where do you grow your food, and where do you put your solar panels? Where do you put those homes or office buildings? I think all those things have got to be thought about, but they've got to be at national level. You can't just have it at single finance sector or single finance companies or companies just on their own trying to navigate that. I think once you've got that in place and you can then understand, okay, this is the role I play and this is what I'm going to do to be able to make that happen.
Anya, I saw you nodding a bit there. What's your take on this theme?
Well, I like this perspective, the holistic transition plan, because that's something we're thinking a lot about now. And there's been so much focus on climate, and for many of us financial institutions, climate is the major impact area, and where we can achieve the biggest change. But nature's social aspects are also really important to take into consideration. And at this point, the business case for nature is not as apparent. So, but we need to start then looking at how can we safeguard human rights, social aspects, and the nature-related risks in our climate transition planning. So I guess that's where we start now, and then I'm really looking forward to advancing with the CSRD. We will get more data, more nature, socially related data from our customers, which will make it easier and support our building of the business case and understanding the challenges and the impacts in the nature space, because those are much more diverse than in the climate space, both regionally but also for different sectors. So a bit more complex to analyze, but over time I'm really hopeful now that we will get some really useful data points that will support this more holistic transition planning for our customers.
I just want to take maybe 20 or 30 seconds each as we wrap up to hear from you either a big gap that you think people in the audience might be missing when it comes to your work to try to drive forward finance for sustainability, or something that you think is a big, bold idea we should be putting out there as a community. Maybe I can start with you, Antonio.
I go as a, well, I think we've talked a lot about regulation, and yeah, I mean, I wish that would be the best option. I'm a bit skeptical on whether in the short term we're going to have a global level playing field, and I don't think that's going to happen. We should converge towards that when, I don't know. What is important is, if I just now address the audience as a financial kind of community, is the power that you guys have to speed up this transition. Sometimes we look at regulations, and obviously for private sector, for companies, for real economy, this is fantastic because it really supports the business case. But some other aspects, such as the CSRD and a lot of things that happen in the landscape of ESG accounting, is something that you have triggered before. TCFD back in 2017 was a financial program, and it was a voluntary disclosure, and it's triggered a lot of change in the way the companies disclose. So, I mean, from Holcim perspective and as a voice of the real economy, we have ambitious targets. We're putting a lot of money into making this progress. We're changing the way we build. From our financial institutions, I'd also invite you to keep on pushing aside of the regulation, so we can all together collaborate and accelerate the transition.
It's a good message. I'm going to ask you to be our last word, Tomas, just because I'm worried about the time.
Of course.
Please.
So I guess, so no one will solve this alone. So I very like you're saying we are competitors, but we are also partners in this. Yeah, and I think it's about the private sector, both the financing sector. I include the insurance sector, because when it's about risk allocation, it's also the insurance sector plays a big role. And I'm also very optimistic on hearing kind of the outlook of what the development banks are planning. So I think this can be, but it also must be a powerful combination to really accelerate the financing for the transformation.
I think the opportunity, as you've all heard today in this panel, and I think you'll hear the rest of the sessions, the opportunity is in the convergence, right? It's where everyone comes together, and chief sustainability officers are very much at the front of this. So it's been a fantastic opportunity to hear from all of you. Please join me in thanking this great panel. And I will just mention that at 10:50, so in just a few minutes, in room D, the UNEP FI Global Roundtable will open. So please join us there. Thank you.